Recording in progress.
Dr. Lane, can you hear me? हाँ लेकिन Hello, Dr. Lane, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Fantastic.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are now heading towards our second keynote lecture of the conference. This lecture is dedicated to the great thinker and national poet of Pakistan, Dr. Allama Muhammad Iqbal. Accordingly, this session is about the return of industrial policy, empirics, and what we don't know. I would like to welcome the chair of the session, Mr. Naji Ben Hassan. He is currently country director for Pakistan for the South Asia region at the World Bank Group. Prior to this, he was the Equitable Growth Finance and Institution Regional Director for the Middle East and North Africa region, following his time as the Director for the Finance, Competitiveness and Innovation Global Practice, where he was responsible for the MENA regional team of the FCI practice as well as its global teams. Ben Hassan is a co-author of the 2009 World Bank flagship publication on the private sector in the MENA region, From Privilege to Competition, Unlocking Private-Led Growth in the Middle East and North Africa. Welcome, sir. I would like to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Nathan Lane. He is an associate professor in economics at Oxford University and a tutorial fellow at Merton College, Oxford. He is co-founder of the Industrial Policy Group, and he has co-founded Soda Labs at Monash University. His research interests are at the intersection of political economy, industrial development, economic history, and big data. Over to you, Dr. Ben Hassan. You have to.
Thank you. Professor Lane, can you hear me? Professor Lane, can you hear us from here? I just need a sound confirmation before I say a few words. Take your time.
I can hear you. My Windows disappeared. I have too many monitors.
Excellent.
So
we can see you well, and we can hear you well. Your introduction was already done, but I want to say one, two words. First, I'd like to say that I'm very, very happy to be attending the annual general meeting and this conference. I was in Peshawar last year, in Quetta this year. I'll attend, inshallah, every single one of them. So really, thank you for inviting me. It's good to be back in university. I could take my tie out. On the topic, and then I'll hand over to you, Nathan, if you allow me to call you this way. By the way, I don't know if there's any football fans in the room following the World Cup, or any Argentinians, or any Saudis. But there's big news. Saudi Arabia has beaten Argentina 2-1. and my Uruguayan friend Gonzalo is happy. Although Messi deserves a World Cup. On this note, I was very excited by the title of the lecture. Very well chosen, given the theme of the conference, and I was equally excited because I apologize, Nathan. I don't know your research, but I would start reading it to see that your current research agenda is focused on establishing basic facts surrounding industrial policy practice. I couldn't have hoped for a better topic and profile. It's a topic I personally got very interested in. I think one paper is an obscure journal on this from a long time ago. But there's a correction in the title of the session when it says the return of industrial policy. We've been talking about the return of industrial policy for 20 years. I think Danny Roderick's paper on industrial policy in the 21st century dates back to what, 2003, 2004? So we've been in this return for 20 years. What, as the World Bank, I can say it as a practitioner, what we miss are precisely that: facts, evidence, how to, and staying away from the old debate, which I think was buried in 2003, 2004, of picking winners, not picking winners. This is past. What we need now are indeed basic facts and evidence surrounding industrial policy. On this intro note, I'm very, very welcome, very, very happy to welcome Nathan Lane, Professor Nathan Lane, to give him the floor for his lecture. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And let me see if I can share my screen as well right now. So let's see this. Okay. Is that showing up for everyone?
Perfect, yes.
Amazing, amazing. So I actually removed the return part of this because I agree. I completely agree with what you were saying. We just keep harping on this idea of the return of industrial policy, right? And I think we know it's, well, perhaps it never went away even too in practice. Insofar as a return, it's returned a bit insofar as popularity goes. And what I'm going to do today is think about I'm going to be very high level. The basic facts I'm going to look at and think about are going to be perhaps too high level to like fully, just to set expectations. One might wish I were in the weeds a bit more. But I'm going to try to give a bird's eye view of industrial policy and how to think about it. And in doing so, I'm going to try to kind of fill in maybe where we might be murkiest when it comes to these basic facts of industrial policy. And I'm going to try to focus on my work on East Asia and establishing a basic facts around East Asian industrial policy. I'm going to try to make some references to Pakistan as well throughout this. But I'm not a Pakistan expert. I'm not going to pretend like I'm a Pakistan expert. I'm just going to kind of try to make some broad parallels here insofar as what we know about industrial policy empirically and what we know about the broad Pakistan experience. And so this idea, right, should states shape the composition of economic activity? Should states shape the composition of economic activity? This idea, this is industrial policy in a nutshell, right? And this idea has been, perhaps it's as old as modern capitalism itself. And this idea of should states play an active role in changing the composition of economic activity within a national economy, it's of course over a century-old debate, right? On one hand, we have a group of scholars, a group of thinkers, and a group of policymakers dating back to Frederick List, but surely dating back to Alexander Hamilton, who saw the state as playing an active, essential role in promoting industrial development, right? And then on the other end of this coin, on the other side of this coin, we have some very influential scholars, those scholars who probably created what we think of as the Washington Consensus and so forth, who really argued, I think, fervently, and argued actually, I think, in a very compelling way. The industrial policy is perhaps harmful, perhaps it comes with pernicious stuff, perhaps it is deleterious to the experience of developing countries, and it's something we should probably stay away from. Right? And so I think it's best exemplified by this quip by Gary Becker, which is often quoted in a Business Week article of his: the best industrial policy is none at all, right? The best industrial policy is none at all, which is a pretty damning statement. And one I think many people have like a conviction to, many people do believe this. And I think with some justifications, right? But the problem is, when we think about this debate, when we think of A versus B, there's an important lack of empirical evidence around this debate. In terms of, especially if we start thinking about the contemporary empirical turn in economics, there is not a lot econometrically that tries to answer this debate and reconcile this debate. And what we try to do in our contemporary work with my colleagues and I is try to kind of fill in, again, some of the basic facts around this debate. We're not going to answer this debate by any means, but we're going to think about, well, where is evidence missing? Where might we be filling in evidence, and what might we not know at this current juncture? And so this is a paper I'm going to focus on somewhat today, called by my co-author Reka Juhas, myself, and my two amazing graduate students. And we're going to think about two sets of questions as they relate to this debate versus A and B, right? One set of questions is about really the mechanisms of industrial policy, right? One set of questions is about, does industrial policy, do the market failures and theoretical justifications for industrial policy, do they exist? Can they be targeted? Are they targeted? In the well-known episodes of industrial policy, such as East Asia, which I'll talk about today, are the theoretical foundations of industrial policy working, and do these things seem to have, in particular case studies and events, do they seem to have some efficacy, right? And so this literature and this kind of approach to thinking about the empirics of industrial policy is really going to be kind of case-by-case stuff. This is going to be the world of contemporary economics or contemporary econometrics, contemporary program evaluation. We're going to think about individual cases, right? And we're going to think of, does industrial policy work in the way we theoretically think it ought to, right? And this is an area where we have, with the empirical turn, albeit slowly, made some progress with industrial policy. My co-author, Reka Juhas, and many others, including myself, Walker Hanlon, who is now at Northwestern, Matti Mitrunen, who's at Finland, people like Murto Kalpsidi, Panlegia Barwork. These types of people have made real kind of inroads in thinking about industrial policy, and it's kind of through individual cases, right? Through empirical study and thinking about individual natural experiments, individual cases, by kind of counting and following the strands, picking apart the causal story of industrial policy and thinking, hey, does it work in the way we theoretically think it ought to work? But like someone like Gary Becker might say, well, that's great. And this is a criticism I get a lot in my own work, and it's something I'll criticize in my own work later in these slides. Another set of questions is like, well, that's fine. That's fine that we can go through individual cases and say, hey, industrial policy worked here, it didn't work here. That's fine if we can talk about the theoretical justifications of industrial policy. But there's this kind of broader question of efficacy. Why does industrial policy succeed in some cases or fail in other cases? Why do some countries get industrial policy right versus others? And that's something that these individual case studies, what we call type 1 questions, really can't get at in a very, I think, compelling way. And to answer these kind of broader sets of questions, these broader sets of questions that people like Gary Becker might be after, people like Anne Kruger might be after, are government failures relevant? Does rent seeking occur? Where does rent seeking occur versus where does it not occur? These type 2 questions are going to really entail a different kind of empirical machinery. They're going to entail kind of cross-country analysis of industrial policy or comparisons of different industrial policy episodes. And while as econometricians and development economists, we've become really good at kind of the type 1 type questions, the individual case studies, individual program evaluation, the kind of broader question, where does industrial policy work and where does it fail? Why do some countries get it right? Why do some countries get it wrong? Sometimes within the same country across different periods of time. These comparative questions require something different. They actually require, in our view, better measurement, basic measurement of industrial policy and collection of industrial policy episodes, of which we don't really have a lot yet. And so this talk is going to be talking about, I'm going to talk about these two domains. Where first I'm going to think about these type 2 questions. I'm going to think about the comparative basics of industrial policy. That is, how do we think about industrial policy? How do we measure the basics of industrial policy in a comparative setting? How do we begin even thinking about what's the comparative experience of industrial policy to get at these types of questions, to get at the comparative questions around industrial policy? And part 2, the second part of this, I'm going to revisit my individual study on industrial policy in East Asia and think about, well, what are the limitations to this study? What do we learn from industrial policy studies like this, these so-called type 1 studies? And where might we kind of go awry if we try to interpret them directly, right? So this is just a broad overview of what I'm going to touch on today. So again, I'm first going to think about these type 2 questions. I'm going to think about the implementation of industrial policy in the real world and how at all do we get at these things in a kind of a cross-country comparative setting. How do we pursue comparative inquiry around industrial policy, which understandably might be a different question than many people, many policymakers in the room might be interested in. But as thinkers of industrial policy at a high level, we want to think about, well, why do some places fail and why do other places not? What do the basic contours of industrial policy look like? Has it even returned? You know, how do we think about these basic comparative facts of industrial policy? And even before pursuing analysis of these basic facts, we as policymakers, we as both policymakers and econometricians and empiricists, we run across the kind of an issue, which is we don't have measures of industrial policy across the world. We do not have comparative measures of industrial policy practice. If we were to think about what do countries do right versus wrong, we'd be empty-handed because we don't even have basic measures of what even countries do in the first place insofar as industrial policy. In fact, we don't even have a shared definition of industrial policy. So how do we think about measurement? How do we think about the basic measurements when it comes to kind of making these type 2 questions, which is a domain where we have very little empirical work as of yet. And so an issue with measuring industrial policy, the kind of fundamental issue of measurement, which we think about in our paper, is that industrial policy is actually not directly observable in the kind of classic sense. And if we think of a tariff, this kind of might illuminate what I mean by non-observable. We can look at a tariff in a country. We can look at a tariff rate. And indeed, a tariff can be a textbook instrument of industrial policy, but it can be used for an amalgam of reasons that are not industrial policy type rationales, right? A tariff can be used to raise revenue. It can be used for terms of trade rationales. It can be used for an amalgam of reasons that aren't just related to changing the composition of economic activity in a country. So to take ex ante a tariff and just think, hey, that's industrial policy, we're misguided. Because that thing, that artifact, that policy lever itself can be used for a multitude of aims, which aren't always industrial policy. So without additional information, we can't discern whether this policy, this measure is industrial policy or not. And this problem is even compounded by the fact that if we think of the shapes and forms modern industrial policy takes, such as subsidies, for instance, a subsidy can have many aims. It can have social welfare aims. It can have social welfare angles. It can have many aims beyond just being merely an industrial policy. Again, merely just kind of creating the conditions for an infant industry to exist or thrive. And so how do we get around this challenge? What we do in this paper and kind of what we do in part of our research agenda is actually think about measurement. Think about actually how do we measure industrial policy at scale? Looking at laws from around the world, or rather policy descriptions. And we're going to use a text-based approach to measuring industrial policy using supervised machine learning and a really, really rich database of policy practice around the world. And we're going to use this as a proof of concept for thinking about how do we construct, much like people in the trade policy realm who construct measures of non-tariff measures, how do we construct measures of industrial policy practice at the country, industry, and year level? How do we do this? And once we do this measurement, can we start talking about the basic facts of industrial policy experience around the world? Can we start thinking about what is it that countries are doing in the first place? All this waxing and kind of like waxing philosophical about the return of industrial policy, well, what exactly are countries doing? What are they targeting, right? Who is using this stuff? We don't know, and then we're going to try to get at this. Again, this is going to be a proof of concept. It's going to more so show the potential of creating a methodology for measuring industrial policy at scale. And again, we're going to juxtapose that with a case-based industrial policy study of mine a bit later. And so our approach it departs from actually taking measures of industrial policy per se, taking those tariffs and analyzing the effects of tariffs on whatever outcome you want. And we're going to think about the language of policy, because we think about the language of a policy, the laws that undergird this, the way legislators, the way politicians talk about industrial policy, actually can tell us whether policy is in fact industrial policy or whether it's not. And so we're going to think about, in fact, we're going to focus on a key aspect of policy language, which is the goal-oriented nature of industrial policy. right? Industrial policy has a goal. Industrial policy often has a stated goal, that is to do stuff, to promote an infant industry, to promote a sunrise industry, to promote a sunset industry. And this is often conveyed in the language of policy. And we want to appeal to that language of policy to actually create a measure of industrial policy around the world. And so this isn't an abstract thing. This is something countries do. Even as they try to maybe obfuscate industrial policy in many ways, this is something, if you read the way policymakers talk about, in this case, a subsidy, they're pretty forthright about the intentions and goals of policies very often. Here we have a Chinese industrial subsidy program. And here, the Ministry of Information Technology is really clearly stating what this policy is doing. This is an excerpt from a policy in our database. They say this policy its goal is to boost growth in the Chinese battery industry, specifically the automobile battery industry. And if we look at this policy, no one would say, hey, this is not industrial policy. This is like a canonical industrial policy. We're trying to promote a nascent sector. In fact, we're going to deploy a subsidy whose intention is to incubate, to promote this nascent industry. And so here we clearly see the policymaker in this text is conveying the goal of a policy. They're conveying what the intentionality of this policy is. And this isn't something that's rare. This is something we find just often repeated. This is going to be hard to read, but just if you look at just a random sample, if you had a world that described a kind of a database, or what we call in text analysis a corpus, something that describes a bunch of policies around the world, countries are oddly forthright, holding constant all the public choice issues of being forthright about using industrial policy. Countries are very forthright about their use of industrial policy to promote national champions. Sometimes in the very names of policies, we see that countries are stating the goals of policy, the industrial policy goals of policy, the program of national champions here in the Kazakhstan Republic. We see also examples like in Japan here, where Japan is actually promoting an old sector, a sunset sector, such as their wood industry, against foreign competition. Policymakers use this kind of language to talk about the goals of policy, and this is something we want to use to measure policy. Moreover, conversely, many policymakers state the goals of policy which are completely orthogonal to industrial policy are really not within the realm of classic industrial policy as we think of it. Here we can think of another subsidy here in Thailand. Here the Thai Ministry of Commerce is announcing kind of a reduction in rice growing zones to stabilize rice prices. And here, if we keep reading this subsidy, we keep reading its description, we see that there's an effort to kind of have a social welfare angle for this policy, for this rice support. Right? It's to stabilize the farmer's income. We don't consider this an industrial policy in terms of our hard definition. We think of this as something distinct from industrial policy, something kind of used for another ends. These are both subsidies that we looked at, but in this case, this is a subsidy that has much different intentionality than, say, a policy that's to promote a nascent industry. And so really, we want to think about, well, if we had a big database, if we had a kind of collection of policy descriptions, one versus the other, could we use these? Could we develop an algorithm at scale to code industrial policy by discerning these two types of languages, by discerning the way these two types of policies talk about their aims and goals? And so that's what that's what kind of our paper is going to do. That's what our methodological kind of approach is going to encompass. We're going to think at scale, can we create an algorithm that can pore over a corpus of a database of trade policy in general and discern where are countries using industrial policy versus where they are not, in order to kind of, again, to talk about just the rough, broad, big picture scope of where industrial policy is happening and what people are doing with it. So we're going to use this to make indices of IP, make indices of industrial policy. But before I go into the kind of details, and I'll only briefly be able to go into the details, we think of industrial policy in a very specific way. And this is a definition of industrial policy, which isn't our own, but it's one that's distilled from institutions like the USITC and particularly the OECD, who's done a lot of thinking about industrial policy. And we're going to think about two kind of prongs that an industrial policy must satisfy. Industrial policy must seek to change the relative prices across sectors, or direct resources to certain selected economic activities, not necessarily sectors. We can think about horizontal policies, we can think about sectoral policies too, And notice we don't talk about agriculture versus manufacturing. What the stated goal of industrial policy is just to change the composition of an economic activity amongst any dimension. It could be economic activity in itself. We could be promoting export stuff writ large without a sectoral bias, or it can also have a sectoral bias. It might be flowing towards an agricultural sector, or it might be a manufacturing sector. No. We don't care about the sectoral composition which someone's trying to change. We just care that they're trying to change something in a coherent, well-articulated way, right? And we're going to also think about the level of government. This isn't kind of a sub-regional entity deploying industrial policy, again, for a very local area that might squeeze out industrial policy, reallocate economic activity across space within a country. We're going to limit our attention to national economic actors who are pursuing industrial policy with a kind of a national goal in mind, a country level goal in mind, or above, the supranational goal in mind as well. And so we're going to take this definition to the data using machine learning, and the data we're going to think about, that kind of magical database of policy that we're going to use for a proof of concept. This database is not going to be perfect, but it's going to allow us to think about industrial policy at scale in some way. We're going to use the Global Trade Alerts database, which is an independent organization that monitors international policies that impact trade. Actually, not just trade, it impacts any kind of commercial activity, and any policy that discriminates against domestic economic commercial activity or foreign commercial activity is going to be recorded in this database. So it's a giant database that's really ambitious and really tries to track the kind of universe of policies around the world. How well it does that is another question, but it's a very ambitious database which will kind of form the basis of our study. It'll form the basis of these policy descriptions which we'll draw from, right? And we can go beyond this database as well, but we're going to use this database as kind of a proof of concept. And we use it as a proof of concept because it has these kind of three ingredients that are really nice, right? It's going to have this main block of textual summaries for us. It's going to give us 100 to 200 English language summaries in a standardized format describing what commercial policy is doing. It's going to also give us, and this is key, it's also going to give us some nice metadata. We're going to know where a policy is being implemented, the year in which it's being implemented as well, the measure type, and the sector which a policy is being targeted towards, if any at all, right? So we're going to get this really nice variation from this data along with this text summaries, which is what's going to allow us to do our algorithmic classification of policies. And we're going to merge this with trade data and other kind of aggregate macroeconomic variables as well. So how do we actually classify industrial policy at scale? How do we create this algorithm for doing such a thing? And it's actually pretty straightforward. It's a solved problem, but if we kind of zoom out and think about what it is we're doing in this paper and in this study, what we really want to do is if we think about these two examples from before, we got the Thai rice subsidy and we have the kind of Chinese battery subsidy. We want an algorithm. We want a function that takes text, such as the text of this Chinese description, this Chinese battery description, and predicts this is IP. It gives us a dummy, so let's say a dummy, that this is IP. Conversely, we want a function that reads this text and maps it to a prediction, no IP, right? We want to, in essence, go from textual representations of data. We want a function that maps us from text to a prediction Y, whether you're industrial policy or not. That's the goal of kind of our classification algorithm. That's the goal of our methodology, is to kind of take these textual inputs, which are policy texts, and to get us a predictive output that we can scale to the country, industry, and year level. And so we do that using a very simple 4-step workflow. We're going to annotate first a bunch of data. This data set's going to have about 30,000 observations, which already tells you it's probably not the universe of all policy in the world. But of those 30,000 observations, we're going to hand label about 2,000 of them to figure out which are industrial policies or which not. We're going to use our definition from above, the definition of industrial policy I showed you before. And we have RAs. The poor students who took my class have to annotate whether a policy is industrial policy or not using our definition, which they're able to do pretty well. And we're going to transform this text into a mathematical representation, a kind of numeric representation of text, I won't go into that. There's a very kind of simple procedural way of doing this. But we take that text and we transform it into data. We can represent text as kind of pieces of data, numerical data, using actually vectorized text, using word vectors. And using that annotated text, using that subset of the 3,000 observations that we were able to classify using our definition, my poor RAs classified this, we're going to train a model. We're going to fit that model F hat, and we're going to figure out what's the mapping from that text X to that outcome Y, to those industrial policy predictions. And we're going to use we use many sophisticated ways of finding that function. But in our case, for this kind of example, and in the example of our paper, we use a textual linguistic regression to make a binary classification to fit that kind of model and to create a classifier that is able to read text and predict it as either non-industrial policy or industrial policy. And so having fit that model on our trained data, we in fact get this F hat. We get an F hat that allows us to go from text to a prediction, to an industrial policy prediction, and we take that function and we run it over our entire database. And we predict throughout this entire 30,000 observation database and other databases as well, this is industrial policy and this is not. And because we have data at the sector, year, and country level, that allows us to kind of create these nice textual indices where we can count. These aren't values, these are merely counts. There's ways to get at values in the paper as well. But to get counts of where are people doing industrial policy and what are they doing to it? What are they doing with it? And what are they even using in the first place? So the goal is to really get this function, this classifier that takes our text and allows us to build text-based indices of industrial policy to, again, establish the basic facts of industrial policy practice around the world and see, can we say anything in a bird's eye view about industrial policy practice to begin even getting at these comparative questions of industrial policy. And so just to give you a brief preview of our model results, even this very, very basic classifier, it's the most simple classifier, probably the most simple classifier you can use. We get a very accurate prediction of what industrial policy is versus industrial what it isn't. If we think of just the model accuracy, it's about 93% accurate at identifying a policy without an industrial policy goal versus those with an industrial policy goal. So it's very good, just even off the shelf without any refining or fine tuning, we're able to very successfully identify, this policy description is industrial policy and this isn't. And you can bump it up and improve this, but we're going to just leave this a very simple model right now. And so you can even crack open this model because it is a logistic regression. Each kind of beta coefficient in that logistic regression is going to be essentially a weight for a positive prediction into industrial policy. So you can crack open the model, open it up, and see what are the most predictive words of industrial policy according to our trained model. And we see that there end up being words that make a lot of sense. Some might be perplexing, like lobster. Lobster is perplexing. There's a lot of fisheries industrial policy going on. But things such as tech, technology, green, things like development, these are words that at face value, we think of something called NLP practitioners call face validity. If we think of valid entities that are being picked up by this model, it looks like this is industrial policy. It looks like the factors that are being kind of incorporated into our prediction are things that seem reasonably associated with industrial policy. It's not doing wacky stuff, barring the case of the lobster and all. And so the whole point is not to kind of produce a fancy model, it's to actually build indices of industrial policy, to actually start saying things about policy practice, not to kind of do fancy machine learning stuff, of which this isn't that fancy. Our goal is to actually say things about the world and say things about industrial policy practice in just some rough way, right? This is admittedly rough. And so if we kind of take the data, take the predictions from this model and start looking at what countries are doing, what are the descriptive statistics that we end up with? And we can think about four things, four kind of descriptive stylized facts. Facts, I should say in quotes, this is a proof of concept. These might not be facts, truly facts about the world, but they're things that are picked up from the data by our methodology. And if we think of how much industrial policy is there, of all these policies that we think of as constituting this kind of big data set of trade policy, we end up about 25% of policies in this database we think of as are industrial policy. That's a lot of industrial policy. Again, this data set is kind of database surveillance project, the GTA. It's picking up any commercial policy that is kind of biased in any way against or towards domestic or foreign entities. So about 25% of the policies in this database are indeed industrial policy, which was pretty striking to us because, even though my colleague on stage is correct, industrial policy, I do believe industrial policy is back. There's some people, as someone who studies industrial policy, I will often get on stage, and this has happened where people are like, "Well, no, people don't do industrial policy anymore." They can't say that now, but during my PhD, people would say that type of stuff. So indeed, we find industrial policy is substantial, and indeed, we find that kind of to my friend on stage's point. If we were just to test the kind of face validity of has industrial policy returned, and indeed has, we find upward trends of industrial policy throughout the world since 2009, a bit after Danny Roderick's return of industrial policy article. This is something we can indeed confirm in the data. And no matter how we measure industrial policy, the share of coverage, the coverage ratio, et cetera, indeed, what we pick up on our data is indeed there is an increasing trend in industrial policy. It's increasingly returning to the world. And it's on the rise, right? And so question 2 is, well, what policy tools do people use to conduct IP? What policy tools are used? And we can kind of disaggregate our data, and our metadata has rich kind of measures of industrial policy. And we can look at, well, what are people doing industrial policy with? And we see that these aren't things, countries are not using the tariffs of the past. That's accounts for a very small amount of industrial policy as it's practiced around the world in our database. What we find is that the vast majority of measures being used by countries are export-related measures. That's going to be key. And there's subsidies if we exclude the kind of export-related subsidies as well. These two things are really going to constitute kind of modern contemporary industrial policy in our data set. And importantly, and this might be familiar to many people here in this room, considering the nature of industrial policy in Pakistan, but in many countries as well, industrial policy is very firm specific. In the laws themselves, we find that industrial policy is probably most assuredly aimed at specific firms, usually specific public entities, who might be the monopolist or oligopolist for a specific sector in a country, right? So we get this kind of contradiction here, which is industrial policy tends to look insofar as its instrument, maybe a bit kind of technocratic. We can argue about words, but it's a bit more technocratic than one would imagine from the industrial policy of the past, the tariffs of the past. It tends to be export promotion measures, but it's also very firm specific. Over 50% of observations in our database are quite firm specific, which if anyone is following the literature on granularity and trade, might not be that much of a surprise, because for many countries, single large firms account for the vast majority of comparative advantage. If we think of the comparative advantage of individual economies, right? And that's Oleg Ishtaki and Cecile Gebra at Berkeley have worked on this as well. So this kind of comports to their theoretical papers on industrial policy correlates with firm granularity in open markets. So which countries engage in IP? And this is surprising to us, with the caveat that our data set, we do not think it captures a global scope well of industrial policy. But what it does capture, like there will be missing pieces of industrial policy in this global trade alerts database. But what we are able to pick up, we pick up a vast majority of industrial policy is being used in this database in wealthy countries. Wealthy countries account for the lion's share of industrial policy use in terms of counts that appear in this database. And again, this is surprising. We're not denying that industrial policy exists in the developing world. Absolutely it does. Low-income countries for sure use industrial policy. But when we open up the data, we indeed see that wealthy countries are doing a lot of industrial policy in the data we observe. It's not just middle-income countries, it's not just laggards, it's not just kind of backwards places that do industrial policy. No. It's OECD countries in our data that's doing the vast amount of industrial policy that we observe. Of course, with censoring issues here as well. And we thought this was pretty surprising. And in fact, if we break that data down by income quintile, we see that really wealthy countries, the top income quintile, quintile 5 here, is really accounting for the vast growth in industrial policy through time. And no matter what, we can chop this data a bit, we can use alternative measures. This relationship between income and industrial policy use really holds in our data. Again, whether that's purely an artifact of the bias in our data set or whether it's actually these correlations are produced by, say, which countries just do a lot more stuff, which countries have state capacity, et cetera, we don't know. But if we control for a lot of stuff, if we dig deep down into this analysis, nevertheless, we find that relationship between income and industrial policy use, again, industrial policy coverage or counts, seems to really hold, even controlling for things like the total number of policies. This is just simply a measure of whether you have industrial policy or not, regressed on your income bin, the omitted category being the kind of lowest, the poorest country, quintile 1, the poorest country bin. We see that even controlling for total numbers of policies, and we're measuring the coverage ratio of industrial policies as well, we see this income gradient. Wealthier countries in our data tend to use industrial policy more in our data. Again, holding, there's probably issues of bias, there's probably issues of reporting, et cetera. Wealthy countries are using industrial policy, and that's something that was pretty surprising to us and a lot of people, because there's this narrative that wealthy countries don't do this stuff, which a lot of us suspect is flamboyant and probably not true. And then we look in the data, indeed, wealthy countries are doing an awful lot of industrial policy. So in our data, it's heavily skewed towards wealthy countries. And which sectors are targeted by industrial policy? What does industrial policy look like? And if we connect our data to trade data, if we connect these measures to trade data, we see something interesting. And I'll try to summarize this as best I can. We see that if we think of the revealed comparative advantage of a tradable sector, the industrial policy is very much correlated with what countries, sectors have a comparative advantage. What countries seem to be good at exporting, they seem to protect, or they seem to use industrial policy for. Right? There is a correlation that's quite strong and quite striking, even controlling for country year fixed effects, between the revealed comparative advantage of a product and industrial policy use. And importantly, actually, when we split our estimates between rich and poor countries, we see actually this correlation is really accounted for by the wealthiest countries. What I mean is this, is that the wealthiest countries are the ones that seem to be protecting things that they have or promoting things, using industrial policy in sectors where they have a revealed comparative advantage, right? Wealthy countries seem to be allocating policy towards stuff they're good at. And if we look at poorer countries, that relationship disappears. There is very little to no relationship between industrial policy use and comparative advantage when we look at low-income countries. So that is to say, and this is a kind of complicated graph to look at, but the takeaway could be put this way. If we think of the poorest countries, middle-income countries, and the wealthiest countries, the richest countries, we think that those wealthiest countries are the best at targeting goods and sectors for which they have high comparative advantage on the world market. And if we think of the distribution of comparative advantage in the poorest countries or middle-income countries, of course, our data is a little more sparse there. We do not find that same strong relationship between revealed comparative advantage and industrial targeting. So that's something that we were quite surprised by in our data, and that's something that seems to survive no matter how we cut the analysis as well. Again, rich countries seem to be better at targeting stuff that they are better at. And indeed, also, that there seems to be, if we also crack open the data as well, and what we describe in our paper, what Rekha Juhas and I describe in the paper, is that if you look at what countries are targeting in the developed world, they're targeting things like green energy, green R&D, we have a lot of this Green New Deal type policies being implemented by the developed world. And that's kind of constituting a lot of the patterns we see as well. As well as the usual suspects like steel, heavy industries, machinery, and stuff like that. You can look in the paper for the types of sectors that we turn to in that paper. How am I doing with time, by the way?
I have no watch, so let me. How is he doing?
What was that?
Sorry?
How am I doing with time?
40. We have 40 more minutes, including questions and answers. So you have a bit more time. Go ahead.
Well, 14 or 40?
40. 40.
Oh, wow. Awesome. Awesome. Cool.
Including questions and answers. So.
Awesome. So, again, our punchline here is not to measure industrial policy perfectly. This is surely not a perfect measure of industrial policy around the world. It's to just take a step back and see, can we start thinking coherently and conceptually about how to measure industrial policy? Can we do this at scale? Can we do this algorithmically using an off-the-shelf data set and off-the-shelf tools, more or less? And indeed, if we start measuring industrial policy, we do see there's some interesting patterns that show up. And we can start describing the contours of industrial policy in some shape or form, where we previously had no bird's eye view of industrial policy practice around the world. Because we think to answer a lot of these questions of industrial policy, where is it done right, where is it done wrong, we have to first start thinking about measurement. We need the data first before we can even think about these comparative inquiry type questions, right? And in particular, we think measurement matters, but
actually,
this is the stuff that's necessary to talk about.
Excuse me to interrupt. Yeah. I was grossly off the mark on the amount of time remaining. I was just told the session was actually for 1 hour. So if you could take maybe,
I can wrap it up.
Yeah, if you can take a bit, like 5-10 more minutes, so that we can open it for Q&A.
Yeah, I'll try to breeze through this really quick. So I want to contrast this with an approach, a case study-based approach, which I pursued to looking at industrial policy. And my work in the past has done what a number of people have done. And we tried to take the kind of econometrics of natural experiments and policy evaluation and actually evaluate particular industrial policy episodes around the world. And while I think this is a worthwhile thing to do, in particular, my paper looks at the heavy chemical industry, or HCI, big push in South Korea from 1973 to 1979. We're able to get at some mechanisms of industrial policy, but we can't get at a lot of comparative questions about industrial policy that truly matter, that we think are truly compelling. And just to kind of give you an overview of what I find in this paper, what we find with industrial policy in this paper, this HCI paper, which is now forthcoming or accepted paper, we find three things. This industrial policy, which we're able to kind of study using conventional difference of difference methods, we find that indeed in this canonical case of industrial policy in South Korea, we find positive effects of industrial policy in the industries that are targeted by industrial policy in South Korea. Well, that's great. We find network effects of industrial policy. We find the policy, or the sectors which are targeted by industrial policy, indeed seem to actually benefit those sectors differentially connected to targeted sectors. And we find dynamic effects of the policy. Well, that's great. Those are all great things. But the question remains, even after this kind of hardcore econometric study, well, yeah, but what about the countries that did this and failed? And so I think that's the underlying problem of these types of case study type approaches. I contest whether industrial policy might be functioning in the way we want it to, ideally, and in this setting. But why East Asian industrial policy worked in South Korea, but failed in, say, the Philippines, but failed in a country like Malaysia, of course, I think takes a more comparative lens in the type of comparative inquiry, which kind of a constrained study like this is quite hard to get at. And just to think, I'm going to think about 2 cheers for this type of work. These case studies are really nice. They give us natural experiments, and RCTs can give us kind of nice variation to think about the mechanisms of industrial policy. But they can't quite inform us as to how this policy did what it did. They can't think about why East Asians seem to get this right versus other countries seem to get it wrong. But I think they're nevertheless still interesting because they can tell us actually basic facts about the industrial policy that is used, because often the basic facts of what East Asian countries did is missing, misunderstood, or wrong. And so I think they still have a place in thinking about mechanisms, but they also in particular play a role in establishing what countries actually did. Because in the world of industrial policy, people say whatever they want. People say whatever they want about industrial policy, disconnected from empirical reality. In particular, if we think about the direct effects of industrial policy in South Korea, indeed, there were amazing direct effects of this industrial policy on the heavy industries for which it targeted. They were able to create revealed comparative advantage in these sectors, like few countries are able to do. But of course, we don't know why was it that these sectors were successful? Why was it that South Korea was able to purposefully to think about cultivating comparative advantage in these sectors versus contexts where countries are unable to do so? I'm just merely able to say, hey, this happened in South Korea. And in particular, I think this is important because then we can look at the policies underlying this kind of creation of dynamic comparative advantage in Korea. And if we think about the kind of policy explanations that a lot of people had around industrial policy in South Korea, here's my late colleague Sanjay Lal, who characterized this policy in a very interesting way. The most intensive form of trade intervention in East Asia was Korea in its HCI drive, the very drive that I studied. And he says, he describes industrial policy as the Korean industries were built up behind high and variable import protection at a speed and with an intensity unmatched in recent economic history. Unmatched in recent economic history. But if you look at the data, these are quantitative quantitative restrictions on inputs. These are these are tariffs on inputs for treated versus non-treated industries. You don't find that's the case. In fact, output markets were not really that protected by East Asian episodes. You open the data and these lines of East Asia using protectionism, overt nominal protectionism to incubate and protect these infant industries is simply not borne out in the data. So this is just to illustrate, I think, a lot of basic empirical things that people say about the way industrial policy functioned in East Asia is probably not right. And it's still room for us to kind of dig into actually what did these countries do in order to think about what did they do right. And I have a lot more to say here. I have more contrasts to think about here. But I leave us with kind of one kind of interesting thing and one interesting lesson from the HCI Big Push is that one thing I find in this Big Push episode is that this policy, which is going to target these red industries here like steel, it's going to positively benefit the downstream sectors like automobiles, those who use a lot of steel. By virtue of decreasing the prices in the steel industry, making steel internationally competitive, promoting exports abroad, blah, 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 that's going to benefit these downstream users of steel and in turn translate to their comparative advantage. But one thing we know if we look across the world and look at the steel industrial policy around the world, we know there's a massive heterogeneity in the experience of these policies. And this is a beautiful article by Bruce Blonigan at University of Oregon in the Economic Journal 2014, where he looks at what are the downstream effects of industrial policy on export development across countries. The average effect is negative. We see, but there's a slight positive effect for developed countries. And we see that you can disaggregate from least developed countries to Asian economies. And there's a massive difference. So the question really remains for policy experiences like HCI. Why do some countries do good industrial policy? How do we get to the East Asians of the world versus those failures? What are the forces that are creating this wedge between these experiences? And so I think it's not just a matter of looking at industrial policy by using natural experiments and careful case studies. I think we need to take a broader approach. Again, if we return to the type 1 and type 2 studies that we talk about, we need to think about both things. We need to think about RCTs to get at mechanisms. We need to think about RCTs to especially get at implementation. But we need real world, cross-country, cross-sector comparisons to get at what were the political economy reasons and institutional reasons why industrial policy is right, goes well in some cases, and why it goes wrong in other cases. And that's where I'll end.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you so very much. Fascinating data and new data and findings. So let me open it up for. I'm not sure you're going to hear the questions from the room, so I'm going to take them and repeat them. I have a set of my own, but I won't abuse my my chair seat. So floor is open. Of any question, comment? Yes, Nadim. Do we have a mic that we can circulate? And we need to do a sound check to make sure Nathan hears. Apparently not. Is mic on? Exactly.
Okay, Nathan, can you hear me now?
I can hear you, yeah.
Great, wonderful. Great presentation, Nathan. I'd just like to find out, I mean, I understand what you've done. What exactly is industrial policy? Because I hear this too often. Never quite figured out what exactly is industrial policy. Is it protection? Is it subsidy? Is it regulatory framework? What exactly is industrial policy? And when you were gathering the data and trying to find out, you were just looking at, I saw the words that you were looking at, but I just couldn't get out. What is the ambit of industrial policy, and what exactly would you say is industrial policy for the rest of us?
I suggest we take two or three questions, if you agree, Nathan.
Yeah.
One, of course,
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Oh, should I pause and take two others before this? Is that
Let's
what you
maybe take two or three and then go back to you.
one, of course, just to reinforce it, those of us who lived in Pakistan believe industrial policies is really a proxy for crony capitalism, but that's besides the point. The point I want, the question I have is, according to Nathan, the developed countries had an industrial policy based on real comparative advantage, okay? Funnily enough, the Southeastern Eastern nations were not focusing on their revealed comparative advantage, but seem to have done much better in terms of where they were and what they've reached. So what should we be looking at? A revealed comparative advantage, which is much more static in nature, versus looking at something in a more dynamic sense.
And Nathan's data show this, or was it a paper? That it does initiate that it did not focus on the RCA products. Should we take a third one? Yes, please, lady on the third row, and then we'll go back to you, Nathan.
My question is that how much sustainability can be built in the model which is based on predictions? Because you use the model which is based on predictions, and the results showed that the countries which are already trading well, they came up in the graph you showed to us. So we need to figure out some model for our type of countries, for developing countries also.
Thank you. Thank you. Over to you for these three questions.
Yeah. So the definition of industrial policy, you're right to be perplexed by it, because people are very sloppy with definitions. And I would say we want to move away from definitions that are contingent upon certain policy levers. Industrial policy is protection. Industrial policy is regulatory framework. It could be all those things. The point of the paper and the point of kind of our work is that it depends how that policy is being deployed. Its stated goals. Of course, its stated goals might be crony capitalism and rent seeking, all this stuff. But we kind of take a step back even further and see what is intentionality of policy. If we take policy at face value, it's at least policy that's meant to kind of reallocate economic activity in some directed shape, form, or kind of way, right? And so it's some types of policy levers that are doing that type of work for us, which have an objective in mind, which is usually to change the structure, the internal structure of the economic activity in some shape or form. The question about static versus dynamic comparative advantage is super interesting. My hot take with some people say, oh, comparative advantage doesn't matter because, and of course, this is a cartoonish characterization. I'm caricaturing how some people describe the East Asian growth miracle, that they targeted things vastly beyond their competitive advantage. What I found in my paper is actually they didn't. They targeted stuff they were just on the verge of kind of they were kind of almost tipping towards global comparative advantage in some way. I think the countries where we see, and we don't have studies that look at, besides like single country studies, we don't have studies that look at where do industrial policies successfully change comparative advantage, whether they don't. That is, we could see this kind of correlation in the data, in the cross-country data that we see for a multitude of reasons. But what we see for East Asia, and what I think is happening in East Asia, and Rekha and I have some comparative work on other East Asian countries as well, is that it wasn't that they targeted countries for which they had established comparative advantage or of which they had like very, very far from the comparative advantage frontier. They targeted things that were more or less feasible. I think that is kind of an interesting empirical kind of sliver of evidence that we get from the East Asian growth miracle. And it goes back to the kind of points we're making before, which is people kind of say whatever they want about the East Asian growth miracle. Let's go and establish basic facts. Let's look at the comparative advantage, both static before and dynamic, of what countries actually targeted. But I take the point of the question. I think it's an excellent question, and it's one I think we still don't have a lot of answers for. The thing about the model is going to be prediction no matter what. It's a predictive model. We're trying to train this language on a set of data and do kind of predictions and try to read and read the policy language of policies all over the world. We were very disappointed that there wasn't a lot of developing countries, especially low-income policies in this data set. What we know anyways, what we know nevertheless, is that we can control for the language of industrial policy that is common across domains. I don't get into that too much in the model, but you can actually, within a model, actually try to incorporate language which differs by a covariate, such as income. You can absolutely do that, and that's something we do. And you can look at actually the common linguistic features across countries as well. Because that's, I think what you say is really important. We need to, and that was our initial goal of the paper, is we want to look at industrial policy around the world. We want to look at it in the places where we don't have a tariff data set that's really reliable. And so we're going to have to do two things. I think the things we're going to have to do aren't just model-based, as you suggested, although that's a great suggestion. I think the things we need to do is actually get policies, get the text of policies and descriptions from other countries to kind of pull from that language and to make sure we're also reading industrial policy language as it's practiced across the developing world better. Yeah, these are great questions.
Can I just I'll use my privilege to holding the mic to ask a follow-on question to this one, and then I'll open it to two more. But on this finding and this graph where you have Germany on the top and developing countries very few, still in your when you construct this data, it starts from the assumption that the policy statement and the words in the policy statement aim to affect the structure of the economy and the sector, but maybe Germany, which its level of diversification is what it is, and because it's very diversified and present in so many products, they have a policy statement or some policy statement, because you need to have a public, if you're in chemistry exports and a small machinery tool export and in cars export, you will have a policy statement on this naturally, because you're already diversified. But if you're a poor country that exports only shirts or only oil countries are not poor, but or an agri product, then you'll have naturally a smaller set of policy statements. So you got my question, so it was a bit long and winded, but I see where you see what I'm getting at. Let's take two or three more, please. Dr. Salman Shah, please.
Were you able to look at the state of the bureaucracy in these countries to see if they have the capacity to implement some policies? And is this, I mean, more like a national strategy for market share, and there are a number of policy interventions which would include industrial or tariff conditions or human resources, etc., etc.?
Thank you. Let's take a third one. I think on the second row, the gentleman was waiting, and then we'll take a fourth one, exceptionally on the third row there.
Okay, I have a question about the industrial policy ambit. The ambit is broad, and you take basically policy statement as industrial policies. So if we assume that we have, it means that we can't have one industrial policy. It could be many, but the problem is if we have many industrial policies, how they basically can be integrated to make an impact. So how they basically be integrated, and how they can be used in a way to reinforce each other to make an impact and not contradict or counteract each other. This is one question. Another question is about the industrial policy. You talk about Hamilton. Even before we had cobalt, and then in 15th century the industrial policy, it exists also in England, and then you talk about the Korea, then China, okay, till World Trade Organization. So industrial policy before World Trade Organization and in the post scenario, they might be different. So my question is, either the industrial policies of the past in the in that era cannot hold lesson for the industrial countries in today's, because there is one World Trade Organization, but there is another component also, which is basically the technology. Take for example Industry 4. So there are many changes happening around the world. So industrial policy will take a shape also. So I think studying or relying our case study on the past, can it hold lesson? It can guide us to make industrial policy in current scenario for the developing country like Pakistan? Please.
Yeah.
Can we take a fourth one and then go back to you, Nathan? I see you taking notes, so I hope it's okay.
Okay, I'm Mohammad Azam Khan. My question is that should industrial policy for the developing countries and developed shall be the same, because developing countries need economic development, where during economic development in industries they can go for the negative externalities in terms of environmental degradations, while the developing countries are focusing for sustainable development with the clean and green environment. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Over to you.
Yeah. I don't know. My hunch is indeed that industrial policies probably should be different across countries, right? In many characteristics and in many dimensions. I have no doubt there. But whether we think about like it differing at a fundamental level, and it should probably differ by the administrative capacity for which it entails and these types of things. I do think there's commonalities, such as the ones you talked about, you kind of alluded to, which is I think they should nevertheless kind of be focused on market failures, right? I think there are these common structural elements to industrial policy which should probably be common. And that gets us to the kind of an excellent question the person before you asked, which I think is one of my favorite questions. Well, industrial policy in the past is different from the industrial policy today. I think that is true in many cases. In particular, the constraints that the WTO imposes and multilateral agreements impose, and especially on developing countries, indeed is going to create constraints. And there's going to be other constraints, technological, there's going to be bureaucratic, all sorts of constraints that are placed on institutional constraints that are placed on industrial policy. So what can we learn? And does that limit what we learned from the past? Indeed, I think it does. And we are limited in what we can learn from the past, but where we are not limited in what we can learn from the past is, again, basic structural building blocks of industrial policy. Does industrial policy, well, one, like what policies were used to do it? I think the policies that were used to do it are actually things that are actually that look relatively modern. Things that kind of showed up as modern industrial policies for the developed countries in our data set are not too unlike the policies which were being used by South Korea, with some heavy caveats. Moreover, the things like that should justify industrial policy. Let's say we want to target sectors for which there are externalities, or let's say even more importantly, for which there's learning by doing externalities at the sectoral level. Are these correlates of industrial policy in the past? Was learning promoted by these industrial policies? Those are mechanisms which I think kind of transcend period, are things that we should nevertheless try to kind of get at. And those are things I think this work does properly. But I think really good historical work should be absolutely caveated with the kind of limits of what we can learn from these episodes. The other question was, I hope I got this right. Wait, are these countries trying to shape their national market share in industries for which we observe in the data set? Indeed, we do see that. We do see that type of language. That language is often reflected in what countries are trying to do with industrial policy. Sometimes pretty explicitly in the data. To get at your own question, my friend on stage, could you repeat your question? I can't understand whatever I wrote is
let me rephrase it. Let me rephrase it. My name is Naji, by the way. It's it's a bit to be a bit provocative. Isn't the data you've built basically a new way of measuring diversification and a new proxy? Because if Germany exports 1,600 products amongst the size, then there's chances you'll have hundreds of policy statements on how they can still increase productivity on mechanics and chemistry. While if you're Chad and you export goats, then you'll find one or two policy statements, and you're just measuring. It's a different measure of diversification rather than measuring explicit interventions to change the long-term structure of your economy.
Yes. It's a great question. I think that's something that once you start opening up the data that you do see is that, oh, well, a lot of this kind of correlation that one might find, and again, these are just correlations, right? This is a measurement exercise, might reflect very mechanical things like scale and scope, the breadth of kind of specialization within the economy, et cetera, et cetera. Big economies do more stuff. Economies with bureaucracies, as someone asked about, do more stuff. We haven't looked at actually these types of kind of state capacity questions. We're just focused on measurement right now. But what we can look at is we can try to cut through and measure industrial policy in terms of shares. We can control for all sorts of things. Like you can easily control for the number of policies. You can easily control for the number of sectors for which you have a comparative advantage. No matter what, it seems like these things survive. Again, whether that's survival, whether that hard correlation we find is an artifact of bias, or where it's coming from is kind of, we don't know. But we do see that relationship between income and industrial policy use seems to nevertheless survive, no matter how we can account for this kind of do big economies do more type thing. Are big economies diversified type outcomes? Which is, I think, a different question. I think that's something that is like, I think there's two types of questions. That's one type of question. Another type of question is, are countries systematically describing things differently? That is there a way that countries systematically talk about industrial policy goals between poor and rich countries? Maybe there are, but we can get at that language. But it's an issue of actually expanding that training data set and expanding the data set rather than, and actually like seeing if our model is indeed doing that, which we don't think it is, versus kind of like this other kind of mechanical question we have here. Like these are, I think, two types of questions, two bins of questions. I think no matter which bin you're in, I think your point is great and it matters. Of course, one we can get at mechanically, but indeed.
Thanks. Fascinating. Super innovative line of research. I was not aware of it. Let's take a last round. Of course, we're going over time, but this is a great lecture and a super topic. So let's take a last round. Please, gentlemen on 6th or 7th row.
Hello, good evening. My question is, does industrial policy guide countries' education policy? And the second question is, does it has a say in drafting the country's foreign policy or not?
Okay, education policy and foreign policy. Next question. We have a last one on the first row. Thank you.
Yes, my question is regarding the second part of your
the initial talk that you gave about looking at the political economy of industrial policy. Do you have any thoughts on how you're going to do that?
And if I may, since we only had two questions, if I may complement this one, is there any way, I'm sure you have thought about this, but in these policy statements, a number of the, you were talking about capture, crony capitalism, Norbert, the gentleman mentioned that as a, it's more likely that poorer countries would hide behind have nice policy statements, actually protection for cronies. Can you distinguish this and in some way, which is related to the political economy question? Over to you.
Yeah. So the first question, does human capital, do we see industrial policy as kind of correlated with, and does it come kind of packaged with human capital policies? Yes, we do. But the things are often distinct and more distinct than I thought they would be. Again, whether that's an artifact of our mismeasurement or whether that's kind of indeed a feature of the world is to be seen. I know from historically, I'm an economic historian of East Asia. I think the kind of human capital component, human capital policy component of industrial policy is way too underexplored. And it ought to be more explored because this is something that's compatible with the Robert Lucas type model of the world. Lucas Econometrica 1993. These are things that should be theoretically intertwined. And there's a paper by Matti Matrunen from Finland, who kind of looks at human capital policy in Finland and its efficacy in promoting structural change in the Finnish experience. And he finds very, very strong effects of human capital inducing type policies that were coupled with industrial policies in post-war Finland. I think that pattern will be seen elsewhere. And we do see some human capital components of policies in our data, but the vast majority are kind of the conventional things that are targeted at tradable goods and tradable sectors, although educational policy does appear. So do we look at the political economy of industrial policy? Yes. We want, so a lot of the questions about do we look at X, do we look at Y, like all those things we want to do, and we've always wanted to do. Like my kind of passion was looking at the political economy of industrial policy because I'm a political economist. The missing link was this kind of thing. Like, how do we even measure these things? How do we even measure industrial policy around the world? To even think about, again, like I'm making the statement I'm making in the paper, how do we even think about these comparative questions? Indeed, we can. You can join, and what we joined is like the Acemoglu-Robinson type data sets or institutional quality data sets and see how these things covary. And so when I asked about bureaucracy, you can see the kind of Evans 1994 type story. Does embedded autonomy type of good, does that affect industrial policy's efficacy? You can explore those types of things with this data. And that's precisely why we're kind of creating a data set like this, not because it's perfect, not because we ourselves are actually doing a lot of these analyses, but because they enable these types of analyses to occur, which gets us to kind of the question of how does language change? Does language change and co-vary with politics? And I think that's a super interesting question. I don't know. We haven't done it. There is a way we can do it, and there's a way we've kind of fooled around with doing it. You can see how the topics vary by measures of corruption and measures of different types of institutional quality measures, and you can see how the topics spoken and language features within this text varies like that. And it does a bit, but we haven't done it systematically enough to be like, this is the way language varies with, say, like cronyism and things like that. But again, that's something we want to do downstream because those are the questions you're asking are the types of things I think are like most interesting. I personally think they're more interesting than the kind of like, the basic contours we're describing. Of course, we want to describe these contours and make sure they make sense and measures make sense even before kind of going there. But those are the questions I'm most excited by, and I'm glad that you all find them exciting as well. Yeah.
It was exciting, fascinating lecture and exchange. Thank you very much, Nathan, for having given the Allama Iqbal lecture at the conference. Really appreciate it. I think it was a great exchange. I hope it will encourage many scholars and students in the room to enter this research area, because there's still lots to do and a lot of innovative data and methods. So thank you so much. Round of applause for the speaker. And on this, many, many thanks. And this is the end of the Allama Iqbal lecture. And thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you so much. This was awesome.
Thanks for joining. Ciao.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lane, and thank you very much, Dr. Naji, for always being here for us. This was last session of the evening, and all the PIDE staff, our speakers and presenters will be going on a dinner. The buses will be waiting outside. Thank you.